I came home expecting to unload a week's worth of laundry. Instead, I found a steel gate where my driveway had been for nearly 20 years. The man standing behind it smiled, tipped his hard hat, and told me I was looking at the future of the county. I remember staring at him for a second before I laughed, not because anything was funny, but because my brain refused to believe somebody could actually erase the only road to my own house while I was away. My name is Owen Mercer, and I live on a little over 9 acres tucked into the foothills where mornings are quiet enough to hear hawks before you ever see them. I bought the place after retiring from 30 years as a heavy equipment mechanic, mostly because I wanted the kind of peace you can't order online or build with expensive landscaping. My gravel driveway wasn't pretty. It had potholes after every hard rain, dust in the summer, mud in the winter, and enough memories packed into it that I could probably tell you where every dent and bend came from. My late wife and I planted maple trees along the entrance the year we moved in, and every fall they turned bright orange like they were trying to remind us that simple things still mattered. The driveway wasn't just a strip of gravel. It was my connection to the rest of the world, legally protected by an easement that had been recorded decades before either I or my neighbors ever owned a single acre out there. Everybody around knew that. The mail carrier knew it. The utility crews knew it. Even hunters who occasionally wandered too close knew where the private road began. Life stayed that way until the land between my property and the highway was sold to a development company called Summit Horizon Communities. They came in with polished trucks, expensive boots that somehow never got dirty, glossy brochures showing smiling families around fire pits, and promises that they were bringing progress to the valley. Progress is a funny word. Sometimes it means better schools or safer roads. Other times it means somebody with a bigger bank account decides your home is standing in the way of their perfect marketing photo. I first met their project director, Daniel Cross, on a cool Thursday morning while I was fixing a fence post near my entrance. He walked over with an engineer carrying rolled-up blueprints under one arm. Daniel had that practice smile people learn in boardrooms, the kind that says they're listening while already planning how to ignore whatever you say next. He asked if I was Mr. Mercer, complimented the property, then casually asked how often I used the driveway. I looked at him, shrugged, and said, "Every day, unless you've figured out how to teach my pickup to fly." He chuckled politely, but his eyes never left the survey stakes along the road. Then he asked whether there were any other ways to reach my house. That question sat with me longer than I wanted to admit. I pointed toward the gravel lane and told him, "That's the only legal access. Been that way longer than either of us has been alive." He nodded, thanked me for my time, and walked away without another word. I watched him leave thinking it had been a strange conversation, but strange conversations happen all the time when developers start sniffing around rural property. A few neighbors even joked that I'd probably wake up one morning with a coffee shop next to my mailbox. None of us laughed very hard. About 6 weeks later, my younger sister called from Colorado asking if I'd finally come visit after canceling twice because of work around the property. I figured the fences could wait, the grass wasn't going anywhere, and maybe it was time to spend a few days with family. Before leaving, I checked on my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Parker, fed her chickens while she recovered from knee surgery, locked up the house, and headed west. It was a good trip. We talked about old family stories, looked through photo albums, and for the first time in years I felt like I had truly stepped away from responsibilities waiting back home. That feeling lasted exactly until I turned off the highway 7 days later. Instead of seeing the familiar gravel entrance lined with my maples, I found fresh asphalt stretching across the hillside, concrete barriers, orange construction fencing, and a locked steel gate sitting directly across what had always been my road. Bulldozers were parked where my mailbox used to stand, and a brand new sign welcomed future homeowners to Pine Ridge Estates as though my property had never existed. I pulled my truck onto the shoulder, stepped out, and just stood there in complete silence. You know those moments where your mind starts searching for some reasonable explanation because the truth seems too ridiculous to accept? That's exactly what happened. Maybe they were paving around the road. Maybe this was temporary. Maybe somebody had made a mistake. Then a security guard walked toward me, glanced at my truck, and said, "Sir, this entrance is restricted to authorized construction traffic only." I pointed past the gate toward the trees where my house sat hidden beyond the ridge and quietly answered, "That's my home back there." He looked uncomfortable for about half a second before replying, "I'm sorry, but we've been told there's no residential access through this point anymore." And just like that, I realized someone hadn't simply blocked my driveway. They had decided they had the authority to replace my reality with theirs. For a few seconds, I honestly thought the guard was joking, but the look on his face told me he had repeated that same sentence all week to delivery drivers and subcontractors. He wasn't trying to start a fight. He was reading from instructions somebody else had handed him. I took one slow breath, looked through the bars of the gate toward the ridge where the roof of my barn barely peeked above the trees, then asked, "Who gave you those instructions?" He hesitated before saying, "Project management, sir." I thanked him, climbed back into my truck, and pulled onto the shoulder instead of peeling away angry like they probably expected. One thing 30 years fixing heavy equipment taught me was that rushing usually makes expensive mistakes. I reached into my center console, grabbed my phone, and started taking pictures. Every angle of the gate, every construction sign, every fresh cut where my gravel road had been scraped away. Tire tracks, survey stakes, drainage ditches, everything. If someone wanted to rewrite history, they were going to have a hard time arguing with 500 photographs and timestamps. When I finally called Daniel, he answered on the second ring, sounding relaxed, almost cheerful. "Owen," he said, "welcome back. How was your trip?" That sentence irritated me more than the locked gate. I told him I was standing outside my own driveway and asked what exactly I was looking at. There was a brief pause before he replied, "We adjusted the access during construction. It's actually an improvement." I frowned. "An improvement for who?" He laughed softly, the kind of laugh people use when they think they're explaining something obvious to a stubborn child. "Our traffic engineers redesigned the entrance. The old alignment interrupted the main boulevard. We created a new route on the eastern boundary. It's safer and it'll add value to your property." I interrupted him. "You don't get to move my legal access because it looks prettier on a sales brochure." His voice hardened just a little. "Sometimes progress requires compromise." I answered quietly. "Compromise requires both people agreeing." Then I hung up before either of us said something we'd regret. My first stop wasn't home because I couldn't reach it. Instead, I drove to my friend Walt's ranch about 3 miles away. Walt had lived in the valley longer than anyone I knew. After hearing the story, he stared at me over a cup of burnt coffee and said, "That road's older than my marriage. They can't just erase it." His wife Linda disappeared into another room and came back carrying an old county plat map she'd kept from a community meeting years earlier. Sure enough, my easement was marked exactly where I remembered it. Linda shook her head. "Developers always think paper is stronger than memory. They forget counties keep better records than they do." That afternoon, I finally reached my property by using an old logging trail that crossed Walt's land with his permission. It took nearly 40 minutes and required driving through 2 unlocked pasture gates, but eventually I rolled into my own yard from the opposite direction. Standing there felt strangely unsettling. My house hadn't moved. The porch swing still creaked in the breeze. My dog barked happily from the fenced yard like I'd only been gone an hour. Yet somehow home no longer felt connected to the world. Looking back toward where my driveway should have disappeared into the trees, I realized I couldn't even hear passing traffic anymore because the entire entrance had been buried beneath construction. That evening, I climbed into my attic and dug through old filing boxes until I found the original closing documents from when my wife and I bought the property. She had always insisted on keeping every important piece of paper in labeled folders. At the time, I teased her about it. That night, I silently thanked her. There it was, the recorded easement agreement, followed by a certified survey completed decades earlier and several county maintenance records referencing the same access route. I spread everything across my dining room table and called an attorney named Hannah Brooks, someone a retired sheriff had recommended years before if I ever found myself dealing with property disputes. She agreed to meet me first thing the next morning. Hannah walked into her office carrying 2 legal pads and a mug that read, "Facts beat feelings." She listened without interrupting while I explained everything from Daniel's first questions to the locked gate. When I finished, she picked up the easement documents, read them twice, then slowly leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "either someone on that project made an astonishing mistake, or they believed you wouldn't have the resources to challenge them." I asked which option she thought was more likely. She smiled without humor. "We'll know after discovery." She immediately sent one of her paralegals to the county recorder's office while another requested construction permits, grading approvals, drainage plans, and revised plats for the development. By lunchtime, the phone on her desk seemed determined not to stop ringing. Every new document made her expression a little colder. Finally, she slid one file across the desk toward me. "See this?" she asked, pointing at a revised site drawing. "Your easement isn't relocated through any legal process. It simply disappears." I stared at the paper. Somebody had literally drawn over my access as though erasing a pencil line from a sketchbook. Hannah tapped the page with her pen. "That's not how property rights work." By late afternoon, she had drafted an emergency petition requesting immediate judicial intervention. I expected we'd wait weeks before anything happened. Instead, the judge scheduled an emergency hearing for the following morning after reviewing the filing. Apparently, judges become very interested when someone appears to have blocked the only lawful access to a residence. The courthouse wasn't particularly large, but that morning it felt enormous. Daniel arrived wearing an expensive navy suit instead of construction boots. He barely acknowledged me, offering only the slightest nod before taking his seat beside two corporate attorneys. One of them smiled confidently as though this would be wrapped up before lunch. Hannah remained calm. She organized photographs, surveys, recorded deeds, aerial images, and county records into neat folders, then whispered, "Don't react no matter what they say." The hearing began with Daniel's attorney arguing that the company had acted reasonably by providing what he repeatedly called superior alternate access. According to him, I had suffered no actual harm because another route now existed. The judge looked down at his notes and asked, "Was this alternate access accepted by the property owner?" The attorney admitted it had not. "Was the recorded easement formally vacated?" Another pause. "No, Your Honor." "Did the county approve extinguishing the existing easement?" This time the attorney simply answered, "No." The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Hannah stood, walked to the evidence table, and without raising her voice displayed photograph after photograph showing the original roadway destroyed beneath freshly graded soil. She explained that my legal access hadn't been relocated. It had been obstructed without consent while I was hundreds of miles away visiting family. Then she stopped talking and let the pictures speak for themselves. The judge studied them for what felt like forever before turning toward Daniel. "Mr. Cross," he asked, "did your company believe recorded property rights could be altered through construction convenience?" Daniel opened his mouth, looked toward his attorneys, then answered, "We believed we were improving the situation." The judge's expression never changed. Improvement and authority are two different concepts. Those 7 words landed harder than any dramatic speech could have. By then I noticed something interesting. Daniel was no longer sitting back confidently. He had both hands wrapped around a legal pad, and for the first time since we'd met beside my driveway weeks earlier, he looked uncertain. I didn't know exactly how the judge was going to rule yet, but I finally had the feeling the balance of power inside that courtroom had started shifting in a direction nobody from Summit Horizon Communities had expected. The judge didn't spend another 20 minutes explaining what everyone in the room already understood. He looked down at the file one last time, set his glasses on the bench, and said, "The court finds that the plaintiff's recorded easement was obstructed without legal authority. The defendant is ordered to remove every obstruction and restore the original access within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in contempt proceedings and additional sanctions." You could almost hear the air leave Daniel's lungs. One of his attorneys leaned over and started whispering as fast as he could, but the confidence they'd walked into court with had completely disappeared. Hannah quietly squeezed my shoulder and said, "We're not finished yet." She was right. The court order was only the first domino. Because the company had altered a recorded easement without authorization, the county engineering office opened a broader review of the entire development. At first, I figured they'd look at the entrance, file a report, and move on. Instead, inspectors kept showing up day after day. Survey crews walked the property with GPS equipment. Environmental staff examined drainage channels. Building officials compared approved plans with what had actually been built. Every afternoon, another white county truck seemed to pull through the construction entrance. About a week later, Walt called me before breakfast. "You might want to drive over there," he said. "Something's happening." When I reached the site, bright red stop work notices were hanging on posts throughout the project. Excavators sat silent. Concrete trucks were turning around at the entrance. Workers stood in small groups, talking instead of building. I later learned the inspectors had found grading outside the approved construction limits, stormwater controls that didn't match the permitted design, and several infrastructure changes that had never received final approval. Once regulators started pulling on that thread, the whole sweater began coming apart. Investors demanded explanations. Homebuyers who had already placed deposits started asking uncomfortable questions. Local newspapers picked up the story after someone leaked the court filings. The headline wasn't about luxury homes anymore. It was about a developer accused of ignoring recorded property rights. Funny how fast public relations can change when legal documents become public reading. A month after the hearing, I finally watched the first bulldozer remove the steel gate that had blocked my road. Another crew spent days rebuilding the gravel entrance they had erased, carefully following the original survey lines, as if those lines had suddenly become sacred. I stood off to one side with a cup of coffee while one of the operators climbed down from his machine and walked over. He scratched the back of his neck and said, "For what it's worth, sir. Most of us didn't know this road belonged here. We just build what we're told." I shook his hand. "I never blamed the people running the equipment," I told him. "Machines don't make decisions. People do." A few days later, Daniel unexpectedly drove to my house alone. There were no lawyers this time, no engineers, no polished presentation. He stood on my porch looking more tired than I had ever seen him. "I wanted to say I wish this had gone differently," he said. I looked at him for a moment before answering. "It could have. All you had to do was knock on my door before moving my road." He nodded without arguing because there really wasn't anything left to argue about. Before leaving, he glanced toward the restored driveway and quietly admitted, "Somewhere along the way we started believing the project mattered more than the people already living here." After he drove away, I sat on the porch until sunset thinking about that sentence. The truth was, I never wanted anyone to lose millions of dollars. I never wanted construction to stop or families to lose future homes. What I wanted was much simpler than that. I wanted the same respect every property owner expects, the understanding that a signature on a deed still means something, even when a corporation with deep pockets decides your little gravel road doesn't fit its master plan. These days I still drive that same driveway every morning. The maples my wife planted are taller now, casting long shadows across the gravel just like they used to. Most people passing by would never guess there was once a steel gate sitting there, or that one decision made in a conference room nearly cut my home off from the outside world. Sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought over money at all. Sometimes they're fought over whether ordinary people still have rights when someone wealthier decides those rights are inconvenient. And that's something I still think about every time I turn off the highway and head home. Now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in that judge's seat, would you have ruled the same way? Or should the developer have been allowed to keep the new road because they believed it was an improvement? Let me know your thoughts in the comments because these kinds of property disputes always seem to divide people. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes common sense should never be replaced by corporate convenience. I'll see you in the next story.